All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National Capital Planning Commission. I'm Elizabeth Miller, Director of Physical Planning, and I'm here with Diane Sullivan, our Senior Urban Planner and Project Manager for the development of the Square Guidelines for the FBI. I'm also joined by our NCPC and our FBI team, and I would just like them to acknowledge themselves so you know that they're here and who they are. Oh, come on, guys, more than this. How about that? Okay. Thank you all for coming this morning, and especially coming in the rain. I also want to thank those of you that have joined us via the web. So that's our clue that we are being live streamed today. This is our second of two public meetings, initial public meetings that we're holding to get stakeholder and public input that on issues that we should consider as we start to develop the Square Guidelines for the potential redevelopment of the J. Edgar Hoover site, which is, as you know, right across the street. There will be more opportunities for public input as we move along through 2016. There'll be at least one more public meeting and at least 3 commission meetings. So today's not your only chance. We are working very closely with the General Services Administration and the city on this very important project. And as you can imagine, this is a very important project to both GSA and their client, the FBI. And because the site lies at the heart of Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and Congress, in a very important location downtown, it also has very important interests both to the local government and to national interest as well. So that's why your input's very important to us. We want to get it today. There is our public comment period for this initial phase of the project is going to go through May 13th. There's going to be several different venues in which you're able to comment. And I'm going to go through those. So you can leave your comments with us today. There will be a box out front. So you can drop them off as you go. You can actually comment on the record. I would just like to make you aware that we are being broadcast. This is being live streamed, so they will be recorded. You can also submit your comments online or mail them in, and there is a comment form that, does one of the staff have that we could waive? So, thank you, Jonathan. There is a comment form. If you don't have that, we'll make sure to get you one. It has all the pertinent information that you need on where you can find the information online to submit online, also where you can find meeting materials, where you can find updates on the project, as well as our mailing address. So that's an important piece of paper that you leave with because it'll have the information that you need to help stay in touch. Let's see, what else? We did have a public meeting. The same meeting we held the same meeting on Tuesday evening. We had a good turnout. We had a good discussion at the end of that meeting. So that meeting will also be posted if you're interested in that as well. So as you all know, new development here really has the potential to significantly enhance the character and improve the vibrancy of Pennsylvania Avenue, and to really create a truly exceptional pedestrian mixed-use environment. So we look forward to hearing your comments tonight, or not tonight, it's this morning, yeah. We were also here very late last night. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Diane, who will get us started.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for attending the first public meeting for the development of Square Guidelines for the J. Edgar Hoover site, currently occupied by the FBI. As most people know, GSA is in the process of consolidating the FBI to one of 3 sites outside of the district. In exchange for the new campus, GSA will give the selected developer title to the J. Edgar Hoover site on Pennsylvania Avenue. So the purpose of today's meeting is to start the process of developing developing guidelines that will inform the future development of this site. And we really have 4 parts to today's agenda. Part 1 is an overview of the 1974 Pennsylvania Avenue Plan and Square Guidelines. Part 2, we'll talk a little bit about the process for developing Square Guidelines. Part 3, we want to dive into what topics should be included in the Square Guidelines. And in Part 4, we'll begin an initial discussion on building massing, meaning the build 2 lines and maximum height of buildings for the squares. So first, an overview of the Pennsylvania Avenue plan. So as we all know, Pennsylvania Avenue is one of the most historic thoroughfares in the world. Guided by the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans, it has served many roles over time, from a rural thoroughfare to a bustling entertainment district, to the backdrop of our nation's celebrations and sorrows. And it has seen a significant amount of revitalization. Over 40 years ago, in 1972, Congress established the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, PADC, to direct millions of dollars in public and private reinvestment back into the street after it had fallen into disrepair. The PADC developed the 1974 Pennsylvania Avenue Plan and Square Guidelines to carefully restructure the avenue into a place that would balance the needs of the nation and the city. And during this time, at the center of it all, the J. Edgar Hoover Building was constructed to house the FBI headquarters. Now, the Hoover Building and site fall squarely in the center of the PADC boundary and the avenue itself. You can see Square 379 sits directly on Pennsylvania Avenue, and Square 378 is north of that. And while PADC was dissolved in 1996, the plan and related documents are still in effect today and will guide future redevelopment of this site. The 1974 plan is the foundational document that includes the goals, objectives, and the development framework for the area. PADC also developed general guidelines which provide uniform standards such as requiring high architectural quality. And then finally, PADC developed square guidelines for each square in the PADC boundary. These provide the most guidance for development and are similar to zoning regulations. So interestingly, square guidelines were not developed for squares with federal facilities. So squares 378 and 379 that house the Hoover Building don't have any. When the plan and square guidelines were created, it was not anticipated that this site would become private in the future. The plan simply describes the Hoover Building itself and envisions the site for federal office use. So anticipation of this, of the site transitioning to a private use, GSA and NCPC worked with stakeholders this past winter to amend the plan. It now envisions the site as a high-density mixed-use development, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we get into the details of the square guidelines. So part two. We're going to look at more detail, actually, what square guidelines are and the processing for developing them. So by definition, square guidelines are detailed urban planning and design requirements and recommendations which are applicable to each square. Essentially, their purpose is to implement the Pennsylvania Avenue plan. We put up here just a pretty typical a pretty typical set of square guidelines and the topics that they include. It ranges from build-to lines to overall building height to guidelines on roof structures, pedestrian features, curb cuts and parking and land use and so on. This is fairly typical of the types of guidelines that you see for the squares within the PADC boundary. Sometimes they're a little more detailed, sometimes a little less, but for the most part, this is fairly common. So I think it's really important to understand how square guidelines fit into the overall development review process, because that has an impact on the types of detail and topics that we include in the square guidelines themselves. Square guidelines are created for the site either before or after the site becomes private. In this case, it's happening before. Zoning applies to the site, but it must be consistent with the square guidelines. It can be more detailed as long as it is consistent. Historic Preservation Review Board and Commission of Fine Arts review processes still apply. And before a building permit is issued, NCPC and GSA review the development plan for consistency with the square guidelines. So our review comes at the end. It's really important based on this that we make sure that what we care about in terms of local and federal interests are captured in the square guidelines. Okay, so here we are. We are wrapping up this first set of public meetings this week, and our goal is to bring a very high-level concept of the topics we think are appropriate for the square guidelines, and even a little more guidance in terms of building massing. And what I mean by that is overall height of development on these squares, and possible shaping in terms of upper story setbacks, and possibly the build-to line on Pennsylvania Avenue to our commission this June. And then we will spend this summer shaping and defining the guidelines in more detail. That will include an information presentation to the Commission of Fine Arts, another public meeting, and then our goal would be to come back to our commission here later this fall with a full draft, another opportunity for public comment, and then come back with the final towards the end of this year. So there really are an additional 4 times for public comment in this opportunity. And then in terms of the larger picture, there are other processes underway this year that are relevant to the development of square guidelines. Federal agencies and other stakeholders are working through the Section 106 process to ensure that this project does not have an adverse effect on historic resources in the area, such as the Pennsylvania Avenue Historic District itself. GSA is working on the final environmental impact statement, which should be available this fall. And lastly, NCPC is leading the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative, which is an effort to update or prepare a new plan for the avenue to be determined. While this project is still in the early stages and won't be complete until after the square guidelines are developed, we're preparing a market study and urban design analysis for the avenue that can help to inform the development of square guidelines, and we anticipate briefing our commission on this effort towards the end of 2016. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break there and just pause for a second to see if there are any questions about the process itself. I must have explained it very well. Okay. All right, so now we get into the crux of today's presentation, which is really about what we should oh, hi. Oh, that was freaky. Topics for the square guidelines themselves, and then starting to look at sort of shaping development. Okay, so one thing I do want to point out is that while, so we are developing square guidelines before a development team is on board. We are also doing this far in advance of when development is actually going to happen on this site. And that presents some limitations in terms of what we can actually include in the square guidelines. They will not be so specific that they will include a specific development program for the site or a parcelization plan. It's not going to say, you know, we anticipate 800, you know, we require 800 condominiums or that anything like that. They will be broader than that because there's a lot that can happen in terms of the market and everything else between now and then. Now that said, this is our opportunity to shape development to meet local and federal interests. So I do think we need to look at a wide range of topics to include. So we saw an example earlier of what what's typically included in square guidelines, and we'd really like your input on what to put into the guidelines for squares 378 and 379. We've listed the topics here that we think should be addressed in various levels of detail. Sometimes it'll be more specific, sometimes more general. They include land use, building massing, circulation, special design guidance, and public realm guidance and sustainability. And I'm going to walk through some of these right now and talk a little bit about what the plan amendment said and then what opportunities we have in the square guidelines. Okay, so land use. The plan amendment addresses land use in some detail. It calls for accommodating high-density development with a mix of uses such as commercial, residential, and cultural uses. It calls for new development to complement and enhance all of the surrounding downtown blocks, and suggests designing ground floor uses on Pennsylvania Avenue to accommodate and encourage everyday activities, commerce, and public uses. So we have an opportunity in the square guidelines to provide more direction if we think it's necessary. While a specific land use mix for the site will be difficult to determine for the very reasons I just mentioned, the guidelines could emphasize desired land uses or ground floor uses on Pennsylvania Avenue, for example. All right, the next topic is building massing, and this means the overall shape of development in terms of volume. The plan amendment has a clear vision for high-density development and states that building massing and articulation should befit its location, meaning new development should look to its surroundings. Two components of building massing are height and upper story setbacks. These contribute to protecting view sheds, creating a consistent building wall along a street, and establishing a scale that is comfortable for a pedestrian. Interestingly, the Hoover Building sits at a transition point for the avenue. Buildings to the west rise up to about 160 feet, and buildings to the east are more modest in height, posing an interesting question for the square guidelines themselves. And then I'll just note that the Hoover Building also, while it sets back in height, it eventually does rise up to almost 160 feet as well. Build-to lines, sometimes referred to as setbacks, indicate the line at which construction of the building facade can occur on a lot. For example, the current build-to line for the Hoover Building is at about 75 feet from the curb of Pennsylvania Avenue. Build-to lines are important because they can have an impact on view sheds, the building wall along a street, and the character of the space in front of the building, in addition to the overall developable area of the site itself. So the plan amendment calls for redevelopment to respect the principles of the L'Enfant Plan by restoring views, provide and contribute to the avenue's distinguished character, and for redevelopment to strengthen the vista of the U.S. Capitol. And so given the broad guidance in the plan amendment, there is an opportunity to look at the site's build-to lines in the build-to lines in the guidelines in more detail, which we'll actually look at a little bit more at this in the next section. Circulation is also a very important concept for a site as large as this one. You'll notice that the single FBI building is comparable to the three buildings to the east. The plan amendment calls for redevelopment to respect the principles of the L'Enfant Plan by restoring circulation patterns. Here is a historic photo that shows squares 378 and 379 in accordance with the L'Enfant Plan. D Street continued through the Hoover site, shown in yellow here, and eventually ran into Pennsylvania Avenue. So this is where D Street ends today, and there's an opportunity in the square guidelines to acknowledge whether the spatial configuration of D Street as proposed in the L'Enfant Plan is desirable. It may or may not be a dedicated right-of-way. There is also the opportunity to discuss other circulation throughout the site. And then with regard to special design guidelines, the plan amendment does not go anywhere near this level of detail. There is the opportunity in the guidelines to discuss things like the facade of buildings, building composition, signage, guidance with regard to signage and awnings on Pennsylvania Avenue, location of rooftop structures, and parking and loading in various levels of detail. And I just mentioned that these all influence the character and quality of the streets around it, both Pennsylvania Avenue and the other streets. And then finally, public realm. These are also very important. The plan amendment does not address these in any level of detail, so we have an opportunity to look at guidelines for ground floor design, landscape, outdoor uses, and the character of the space in front of the building. So that was a brief overview of the topics that we are thinking about including. I'm going to take just a minute here in case you want to jot down any ideas, or if anybody has any comments, would love to hear them now with regard to, are there other things that we should include? These seem appropriate. So I'll just, yes?
Are there any considerations to streets other than just Pennsylvania Avenue? So for instance, like East Street, because right now East Street, there's absolutely nothing there. So one of the things you just mentioned was ground floor uses on Pennsylvania Avenue to accommodate and encourage everyday uses. So it would be nice if that were also true for E Street and 10th Street and 9th Street, just so one of those streets isn't exclusively parking and loading dock access,
Yes, I agree with everything you said. And yes, the square guidelines, there is an opportunity. We will be addressing that in the guidelines as well. And I think it's a really interesting point because, especially with E Street and 10th Street, I mean, what's happening on the other side is a much, more detailed, much more granular scale. There's a lot of interesting retail and stuff happening on those sides. So, and we'll talk a little bit too in a minute about this notion of retail and is it possible to accommodate it on all, everywhere? And, at least with regard to Pennsylvania Avenue, do you continue it all the way along, or do you have clusters of retail, and what's the better way to go? So it's a good comment.
Would the type of proposed building structures change some of these components for this?
You mean when
For example, if you want to say a sports arena on
Yeah.
the spot, just only as an example.
Yeah.
That didn't change some of that as far as the planning for that, or would that still have to fall?
Yeah, it would. I will say that because the plan has now been amended, so there's the plan and the square guidelines, and so the plan is sort of the overall vision, and that vision now for this site is high density mixed use development. I don't know that would include a sports arena, probably not. But I mean, yes, I guess in the future, I guess something could be proposed that would not be consistent with these guidelines. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's what I'm
yes.
saying. Just
Yeah.
that, to depends on what type of structure would be.
Right, but the future development plan will need to be consistent with these guidelines. So
Thank you.
whatever is proposed has to be consistent.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else on this particular part 3? Because we will go into part 4, and then if anything comes to mind, we will have lots of time at the end of this to answer questions.
I might just want to clarify one thing. If in the future something other than what the plan amendment envisioned were to be proposed, there would be there is a process or an opportunity for a future developer to work through GSA and request that a plan amendment. They could go and ask for the plan to be amended, and any other use could be considered, but it would be a whole different process. So it wouldn't preclude something from happening, but it would have to kind of start over, go through a plan amendment, and then new square guidelines would be developed. So, this one.
Okay, so the last part of today's presentation is an initial look at the build-to line for Pennsylvania Avenue and overall building heights. This gets into a little bit of technical, it's a little technical. All right, so we've already spent some time discussing build-to lines. They're an important concept because where a build-to line sits on a street in relation to other can positively or negatively impact view sheds, the overall building wall of the street, the height of buildings, and the developable area. One example is if, in looking at this picture, if you were to move the buildings forward, they could, depending on their height, start to narrow the view of the Capitol. So there's an interesting relationship between where the building sits on a street and the height of the building as well. And we'll start to look at that a little bit today. Now, the build-to line also affects the area in front of the building and what you can accommodate in the space, such as in the example of Pennsylvania Avenue, a single, double, or triple row of trees, pedestrian movement, space for outdoor activity, and very importantly, it can also reduce or increase the developable area of the site. And so we'll take a look at that as well. So we actually have 3 big challenges in determining a build-to line for this site on Pennsylvania Avenue. The first is that the dimensions of Pennsylvania Avenue have changed over the years and the build-to lines are no longer consistent from block to block. The second challenge is that the build-to line has impacts for both the avenue as a whole and the site itself, and both of these need to be considered. And the third is that we really need to establish guidance on a build-to line before having all the answers regarding a specific development proposal for the site and recommendations for the entire avenue from the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative, which will be looking at possibly changing, could look at changing the width of the whole avenue, and then that would, you'd have a whole new, it would be a whole new analysis in terms of the building lines. And that will be happening in the future. So let's take a look at how the avenue has changed over time. In 1791, L'Enfant designed the avenue as a direct and large avenue with a walk on each side planted with double rows of trees, 160 feet wide, like all the avenues in this city. It, however, was never implemented. Instead, Jefferson spent 1/4 of the city's improvement budget to plant 4 rows of fast-growing poplars the full distance of Pennsylvania Avenue. And you can see this section here, it has multiple carriageways, still 160 feet wide. By 1901, the McMillan Plan proposed the Federal Triangle, and Pennsylvania Avenue had changed once again. This time, the cartway was widened to about 107 feet, so the area where carriages travel has been widened. And the sidewalk area was reduced to 26 feet, accommodating just a single row of trees. And then in 1974, the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation altered the street one more time. It was determined that the larger cartway needed to remain, but that because there were a lot of cars at this point, but that the sidewalk area was not large enough to accommodate pedestrian activity and amenities. So, under the PADC plan, the sidewalk of the avenue's north side would be widened by 50 feet where new construction was going to occur. Now remember, it was already 25, so now it's getting widened, so it's a total of 75 feet now. And then, and it was to accommodate 3 rows of trees. Historic buildings would remain, and that's where it's tighter. The sidewalk area is around 25 to 30 feet. And then on the south sidewalk, the avenue would be widened just a little bit more, and it would accommodate 2 rows of trees. And for the most part, these conditions are still in effect today. So the area in dark green represents where the build-to line is 75 feet from the curb, largely again on the north side of the street where the major redevelopment was happening. The light green around 45 to 50 feet. And then the red shows where some of the historic buildings are, and you have the 25 feet, and you have about the 25 feet. So while it varies, you can still see the significant portion of the avenue is at least about 45 feet. The build-to lines are about 45 feet from the curb. And of course, the rows of trees increases with the larger build-to lines. But it does definitely change as you move towards the Capitol. Okay, so first let's look at what it would mean to reestablish the L'Enfant Plan, which is a very important policy for both NCPC and the district in terms of reestablishing it whenever we have the opportunity. Under the changed conditions of Pennsylvania Avenue, this would mean that the development on the Hoover site would move forward 30 feet from the curb. This presents some benefits and some drawbacks. So this is an area of the avenue where the build-to line is around 30 feet. The benefits are that it allows for more development, and I think most people would argue that density is needed on the north side of the avenue to better activate the street. Moving the build-to line forward also makes the building wall a more prominent element of the street. And here's another example. This is a little less than 30 feet. In some ways, it's very urban and intimate. You know, it's interesting, we heard some comments on at the public meeting on Tuesday night talking about 7th Street and the hustle and bustle on 7th Street. And, you know, a lot of people like that, that frenzy and that it's crowded. And then some people didn't care for it at all and try to avoid it. So it's a really interesting question, I think, for the build-to line on Pennsylvania Avenue. A more typical condition, especially on the south side of Pennsylvania Avenue, is a build-to line around 45 to 50 feet. This accommodates a double row of trees that L'Enfant envisioned and space for outdoor activity if desired. There would be still space for some outdoor activity also in the 30-foot build-to line as well. And this is where it would actually be similar with what's going on the other side of the street at the Department of Justice. And this is an example where the face of the building is about 50 feet from the curb. And then there's the current situation in front of the Hoover Building where the build-to line is 75 feet. This is the same as the block to the west. So here's the Hoover Building. I think now most would argue that this space doesn't work at all. Is it because there's no ground floor uses, no furnishings, or is it simply too much space to really ever be successful? This image is also a good example of how the build-to lines on the avenue don't align. You can see Market Square moves up substantially to about at the tightest point of the corner, where if you're familiar with the Wells Fargo there, it's about 35 feet from the curb. So now let's look at how moving the build-to line changes the wall of buildings along the avenue and how it changes the pedestrian experience. We'll talk about how the build-to line and height can change views of the Capitol in the next section. So right now we're just going to focus on the wall of buildings and then experience as you're walking down the street. So here we are standing in the center of Pennsylvania Avenue looking towards the Capitol, and you can see the FBI building labeled there. Okay, so now we've moved into the modeling world. Haven't done anything. This is existing conditions. That's the FBI. So right now what we have is, start at the Evening Star. We had an image of that. That's where conditions are around 25. It's around 25 feet. The building line, the face of the Evening Star building is about 25 feet from the curb. And then as you're walking down, it actually opens up at 1001 Pennsylvania. And this is, if you're familiar with Central and the Tadich Grill, those two restaurants sit at the corner of that 1001 Pennsylvania block. Those are set back. It's a 75-foot build-to line. I'll point out that's probably not going to change in the future because actually in that build-to line is the old historic D Street right-of-way. So that building is probably going to remain where it is, or if a new building's built, it will be in that same space. And then you have the same, and there's the 3 rows of trees, and then you have the same condition at the FBI site with the 3 rows of trees, the 75-foot setback, and then as I mentioned, Market Square is moves forward for a quick moment at the corner and then opens up into the Navy Archives Memorial. One thing I do want to point out, and we were talking about retail earlier, is that at 1001 Pennsylvania, you do have restaurants, outdoor seating, happening in that space, and you have very successful restaurants and outdoor seating also at Navy Archives. And I think one of the questions we're grappling with is, you know, is that something you want to extend all the way? Is that actually possible from an economic development perspective? I mean, there is a point where you have too much, and you know you're relying too heavily on restaurant retail on the street, or do we cluster? And in that regard, do you maybe move the FBI building up? And then have more of an enclosed space at 1001 Pennsylvania, and then also the archives, and we'll look at that now. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the FBI building forward to 50 feet. So we're at 75, we're going to move it forward, and we just decided to stay with the FBI massing, so instead of proposing any new building. So there it is. So now actually it sits, it pushes out in front of 1001 Pennsylvania, but it's now the build-to line is now exactly the same as the across the street with the Department of Justice. And so in this, here you could accommodate 2 rows of trees, and you can still see Market Square in the background. And then if you bring it forward to 30 feet, which would be the dimensions of the L'Enfant plan, from this perspective, you pretty much can't see Market Square anymore. And actually, if you were standing on the sidewalk, you definitely wouldn't, because it would come out in front of Market Square. Now, in some ways, this is interesting because it actually encloses the space at 1001 Pennsylvania, and that actually might seem beneficial, again, more intimate. But on the other hand, I think you might argue that wall now is a little imposing on the other side of the street, and you can't see Market Square anymore. Okay, so now we're just going to run through those from the other perspective one more time. So here's the FBI building. Here's 1001 now in the background, Market Square is in the foreground, and we're sitting at the 75 feet from the curb. And then if you start to move it forward, this actually looks like it sits, and it actually does, sits in the middle of, we've brought it forward 50 feet, so it's in between the 75 foot of 1001 and the 35 foot of Market Square. And, this looks pretty good. And then you move it forward one more time, and now it has come up. You can no longer see 1001 Pennsylvania, and it, actually, it's fairly in line with Market Square. Again, there's only 5 foot difference there. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff that we're actually looking at and studying right now. And I do want to say there is the last thing to consider, and it is just as important, is the impact of the build-to line on the development plan for the site itself. Let's assume that the spatial configuration of D Street is required. So the square guidelines say that that you can't build in that area. There are many different ways in which squares 378 and 379 can be designed. The development project could focus activity and public space in the interior of the site, such as city center, which is actually also wrapped with retail and stuff on the outside, but it has a huge focus towards the interior. And this might argue for less space on Pennsylvania Avenue. Or alternatively, you could really focus that activity on the streets and avenues at the exterior of the site, such as Pennsylvania Avenue and East Street. And this would argue for possibly a larger build-to line on Pennsylvania Avenue. So again, these are the types of questions we're considering as we develop the guidelines for the site. So what we'd really like feedback on is in terms of the pedestrian experience on the avenue, what elements are important. Should these elements be consistent or along the avenue, or is it okay for variation? Should you have consistent retail, or is it okay to not have, restaurants, retail everywhere? Is it okay to not have a double or triple row of trees? These are things that we're really looking at. What do you see as the benefit and drawbacks for different build-to lines for the Hoover site? And then is there additional analysis or other information that you think would be helpful in determining this build-to line? So I'm going to take a break here. There is one more section on height, but see if anybody has any comments on this part that I just presented. Can write stuff down too and turn it in. Yes?
What about 9th and 10th Street? Because we have those big, What about 9th and 10th Street? Because you have those pits or the moats. Yeah. So are you also pushing out to meet those?
Yeah, that's I don't have, we're definitely going to look at that because, if you travel from north to south, it changes. I think we're all looking at, what it means to be compatible with surrounding sites. That we haven't focused so much on that yet, but we'll definitely be getting to that point this summer. Yeah. It's hard because when you get towards, as you cross Pennsylvania Avenue, it comes in. It's really an interesting transition point between development downtown and then the federal development, and where does this site fit in that? It's a larger question that we've been grappling with. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
Okay, thinking outside of the box, what about alignment to D Street along Pennsylvania Avenue?
You mean like put D Street in? No.
Yeah, having nothing on Square 79, 379.
I haven't heard that yet, but
I know, I said it's way outside the
tonight.
box, but anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
Any other comments on this right now? And we have one more section. It's a very short section, but it might spark some additional comments with regard to the. Oh, sorry. Yes.
You raised a question about continuous retail and
Yeah.
the economics of it, and it's so far ahead of when it's going to be done.
It is.
Is there some kind of contingent way to build in some economic analysis in the interim, I guess, before sort of final adoption?
We, NCPC is working on a market study for the larger avenue as part of the larger Pennsylvania Avenue initiative. And I think it will be helpful in terms of, the feasibility of different uses on the avenue and what it's going to take to actually, get some of the stuff that we might want to see here. I think a lot of it depends on whether residential goes in on this site, which could really drive a lot of the ground floor uses that happen. And so it's like as you mentioned, though, the challenge is that this is happening, well in advance of, when development will actually occur. So I'm hopeful that the market study, which I think will be available, when will the market study be available, Beth?
This fall, when we,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, so it will be available to help inform this.
Do you all have the flexibility to require a higher level of residential in the site guidelines, or is that, as the actual detailed use, something beyond?
That is a very interesting question. In terms of the square guidelines, there have been a couple instances, largely when the development team is on board and the square guidelines have been developed, where it does very specifically say, you know, an X amount of retail, X amount of residential. Most of them don't go into that level of detail. But one thing though is that we could talk generally about the types of uses that we want to see on this site. And the plan amendment already, you know, the plan already does that. It is possible that, you know, if that zoning could come in and, you know, require other things, although right now it does not. So, not require other things, but be more specific about it. Sorry, yes, big difference.
And just, I think you may have missed this at the beginning of the presentation, but since we are working on this prior to a developer being on board and well in advance of development occurring, our goal is to shape and really inform the developer on what's important to both the local and federal interest. And I think some of the questions you're bringing up are important, particularly to local interest. And we can give it our best shot here, but there are provisions in place that as the market changes and as a developer's on board and they get a more specific development program, there is the ability for the developer to come in and work through GSA to do much more specific guidelines. And that's very likely could occur. So we are doing something now to shape and give the developer direction and doing the best we can, but there's nothing to say that they have to come back in if their proposed development meets our guidelines, but it's likely they may come back at a future date with more specificity.
Currently, there's no street parking anywhere, and anywhere along that block. So one of the benefits is that traffic flows pretty well, but then of course it's harder to find parking. Is that something that will be included in the plan? Or is that kind of a more detailed, like if there's going to be street parking or?
You know, the plan is fairly specific. I mean, it provides good guidance in terms of Pennsylvania Avenue and curb cut, you know, no curb cuts and things like that. With regard to the other streets, I don't know at this point. I mean, we'll definitely look at that, but again, it's an interest. You know, when it comes, there's the issue of the street parking and then parking and loading itself. And so when you don't have a parcelization plan or a development, a master plan for the site, essentially, it's sort of difficult, I think, to put together specific guidelines or regulations in terms of where access needs to be and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure. I think there's going to be a middle ground on that. Anything to add with regard to street parking?
I think part of the challenge today with the on-street parking is that it has actually disappeared over time. I think in my recollection, I've lived in the area for a while and there has been parking, and as security is tightened, it's disappeared. I think with a different kind of use here, we would see more on-street parking along particularly the north and east and west streets. Maybe not 9th because of its arterial type of nature. The parking requirements for the use itself is a kind of a big question and where that would occur. But I think we definitely will be trying to tackle some of those issues and setting goals. I mean, part of this, our intent here is to set some objectives and that we can try to meet and good planning practices.
There are comments, questions on this section? Oh, yes.
So I'm going to monopolize this, I guess.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I like the first question up there. And I have to say, walking along Pennsylvania Avenue, when you're going a long distance, it just does not, what it is intended to do is one thing, and what you actually feel is another thing. In other words, what you're trying to do is to recreate a boulevard, in Paris. Obviously, the dimensions are way too wide, and the building's too short proportionally to kind of get that canyon that you want to feel. So with that said, the 75 feet is just ginormous there, and it's deadly. Yeah, I know even if you were to activate the street level with commercial entities, I still don't think you would have the volume of people that could really make up for that huge amount of space. Plus, as far as sustainability, it's all hardscape too, which is really too sad about that. So with that in mind, I mean, and also for outdoor activities, while the cafe shots are very alluring, here in DC, we have to really think about what's that time span of active cafe use, and designing with that in mind. Or, we have to think about winter as well. So I would tend to really promote the shorter distances or narrower distances, whether 50 or 35. It seems like 50 is a good compromise because you still have enough elbow room. Also, in a couple of the photographs too, where you were at neck down to 30 feet, I think, in one of the shots. You also, I kind of laughed because not only did you have a main building entrance there to the left, but you had a tree grate right in the middle of it. So, so it was necking down even more to get around the tree, to get around the steps, and then to get away from the parked cars and the doors opening there. So, I really think that it would be better to kind of tighten it up a little bit more and not replicate what is there now. And I would do the same on 9th and 10th Street. Really look at that because it just seems so vast.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned about the developer, is the developer presented as a developer and talked about yet for the specific site, or just speaking in generality? Yeah.
Just speaking in generalities, the development, GSA anticipates selecting the development team by the end of this year.
Okay. How does the public that is here present also get to comment to that developer for a specific or championing a specific design and proposal for this site? Or would that all go through you guys?
There will be opportunities through the review process once the development team is on board for the public to comment. So you have sort of the CFA, HPRB processes, NCPC review. Well, it won't be public for it. It won't be at NCPC, and then as yet to be determined, but the zoning process as well. Okay. Oh, yeah.
I think it might be good just to explain, perhaps to stimulate any other public comment on the values that are some either go together or maybe in conflict with each other. I think you're doing a good job of explaining the physical issues, but I think for everybody's benefit, it's important to understand that there's a whole lot of answers that are possible. And I think this process is intended to try to come up with something that probably gets to the best vision for this property on the avenue. It's hard to separate a little bit from what is the avenue going to be. But so right now it's being presented somewhat as it's a broad urban design question. But there's just the idea of that front setback line. There's a whole lot of things that could be considered, and these are just these are things maybe if anybody has any more comments to talk about. The most obvious of which from the federal government's side, GSA side, is that the closer that comes to the street, the more that the site is worth. That's just one value that has to be balanced. Another is the corridor of Pennsylvania Avenue generally is a civic corridor. How does it? We talked about this. How does it frame the view? What does it mean to have it come in and out? What does it mean? Does it need to actually have a certain breadth of sidewalk for the potential for presidential parades and that thing? That's once every, inaugural parades are every 4 years. It's not necessarily the driver here, but again, these are important things. Another question is historic preservation. We've got a streetscape there that was implemented designed sort of in the 60s and 70s and implemented into the 80s. It has some historic value the way it is with the trees. On the other hand, if you look at the L'Enfant plan for the city going back to the late 18th century, the street wall would have been further up. So those are other things that can balance, and you may decide that you go to, again, people have talked about a third option, which is neither one nor the other. Then there's the question of it's been talked about retail and restaurants and what's optimal for the appropriate width of the sidewalk, people moving through, having outdoor or even perhaps sidewalk enclosures. Are they semi-permanent, permanent pieces that bump out into that public right-of-way? What's an appropriate level of activity? Or to some extent, this stuff could be really great and a great attraction, or it could start to get junky. You got to think about what that would mean. Finally, this is not quite on topic for this building, but in the long run, what could be happening in Pennsylvania Avenue anyway? Do you want to keep any extra room so that you could have staging certain kinds of programs, public events, fairs, whatever in the right of way generally? So I'm just listing about half a dozen things that all have to be balanced, and we're trying to get to something that seems to satisfy the most issues right now. And I don't know if that elicits any other thoughts from the public about it, because we're trying to get to I think people are trying to get to the right answer.
It's difficult.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so I'm going to move forward with the last section here. This is going to give you a preview on height, and it's actually pretty.
Before you start that, and I think with what Diane's presented and what Mr. Lupke has kind of posed as a broad question is really ruminate on that, and any thoughts you can give us, online, mail them in, would really be appreciated, because I think these are these are the issues that are important to GSA. He just summed it up. These are the issues that are important to GSA. These are the issues that are important to the city, as well as to the national interest. And it's like, how do we balance all this? And not to say any one is a higher priority than the other, but this is the kind of input we're looking for.
Okay, so this is actually a pretty quick section. The 1910 Height Act regulates the maximum allowable height of buildings in DC, and zoning and square guidelines in this case can be more restrictive, but the maximum is defined by the Height Act. For buildings that front on Pennsylvania Avenue, the maximum height allowed is 160 feet. There are a few different ways per the Height Act where buildings on squares 378 and 379 would be considered to front on Pennsylvania Avenue, even if the spatial configuration of D Street is required in the square guidelines. This means that buildings could achieve 160 feet in height on both squares under certain conditions. And what we need to determine through the square guidelines is whether this is desirable. Now, as I mentioned before, the Hoover Building is sort of at the transition point of height along Pennsylvania Avenue. To the west, you have your taller buildings around, bumping up against 160 feet, including the Hoover Building itself, although it actually steps back a lot before it gets to 160. And then to the east, it starts to decrease. You see the Market Square around 140, and then further decreases towards the Capitol. And while several buildings do go to 160, the initial building height on Pennsylvania Avenue, shown in yellow, is substantially lower. The FBI starts at 108 feet and then sets back to eventually reaching the 160. The Pennsylvania Avenue plan is really clear about these initial building heights on Pennsylvania Avenue being compatible with their surroundings and setting back to 160 to protect views of the Capitol. And so here you can see the Department of Justice initially rises to 105 feet on the avenue and then sets back to 127. So definitely not as tall on the south side of the street. And then looking back the other way, you get a good view of Market Square, which rises to about 102 feet and steps back to 140. So, I think the question that we're grappling with is people were pretty clear that they want this to be a high-density mixed-use development, and our question to you, especially I would argue for the interior of the site, is 160 appropriate for this development? So that is one question to think about. And then the other piece is to look at the initial building heights on Pennsylvania Avenue. And so this is the same set of images that we looked at before, and now I want to look at them again and look at how the build-to line changes the impact of the initial building height as you move the build-to line. And consider whether moving that build-to line changes the view of the Capitol or the symmetry of buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue. So here we are, we've moved into modeling mode again, and you'll notice the dotted yellow lines illustrate the general symmetry of building heights and upper story setbacks that PADC had required. This is the existing conditions, again, with the FBI building in between 1001 Pennsylvania and Market Square, and this is currently at the 75-foot setback. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that massing of the FBI building forward. I'm going to keep its same height, initial height, at 108, and we can start to see what happens to the yellow line there. It moves up a little bit, so it's not quite as symmetrical with the yellow line on the other side of the street, which again indicates the line of the initial building heights and forms that cone view of the Capitol. But this is pretty nuanced.
This is 50 feet, right?
Yeah, this is at 50. And then, and I left that, I don't know if you can see the faded yellow, that was the original 75. And then you move it forward again to the 30-foot dimension, the L'Enfant Plan dimension, and now you can see it actually really starts to shift the symmetry of those lines. Now, one of the things that you could do to bring that line back in symmetry with the line on the other side of the street is to reduce the building height. Or maybe this is okay. Maybe it's okay to have taller, stronger buildings on the other side of the street. So again, this is another component of what we're looking at in terms of trying to develop these initial square guidelines for the site. And so with that, we have another set of questions for you. Given that the plan amendment envisions the site as a high-density mixed-use development, and that the Height Act would allow 160-foot buildings under certain conditions, what should we consider when developing guidelines related to height, and would 160 be appropriate? And how important is the symmetry along the avenue? Now, this can be achieved through the building wall, it can be achieved through the tree canopy, or both, or maybe it's not that important. And then finally, again, if there's any other analysis or information that you think would be helpful in tackling this question of overall building height and initial heights of buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue, please let us know, because we are anything we can do to help us all get to some agreement on this, it would be great. So that includes my part of the presentation, and I'm happy now to really, if there's other comments on height, comments from anything before. You guys have already provided a lot of good comments, but happy to entertain any of them now. No one has anything to say about height? Yes.
This isn't exactly specifically about height, but it certainly relates. GSA obviously has an enormous incentive to maximize the value of this property in its trade scheme for the new FBI. And as I understand it, that decision about developer is going to be made soon, so presumably the proposals incorporate some assumptions about the value of the site and what it can be built to. Have you all participated in setting some of those assumptions, or?
So, anyone from GSA, please chime in here, but I'll take a first stab at this. So one of the reasons we are trying to tackle the height issue, build to line, and general shaping first is to help inform the proposals that the development teams are working on. And so that was the intent for trying to bring a draft concept to our commission this June, is to hear the National Capital Planning Commission comments on the direction that we're headed, and with regard to, whether we require D Street or not, or, and the maximum allowable height of buildings. And I think that would be while it's not the specific set of guidelines, I think that is a lot to offer in terms of being able to value the site. It's enough for the development teams to work from. So hopefully we'll have some good comments from our commission in June. Proposals, I believe, are due June 22nd. So we're giving them not very much time, but yes. But they're also probably listening to, these meetings and trying to get glimpses, listening to what people have to say too.
I think I heard you say that the option of developing the square the two squares that they currently are now as sort of together is on the table, as is sort of doing it as two parcels, although the diagram shows it as kind of two separate squares. Is the decision made that it would be two squares developed with some?
Well, the only decision that I think we'll propose to our commission is regarding whether that spatial configuration of D Street is required to not be built on. So I anticipate that we'll be putting together a proposal for that. But in terms of parcels and things like that, how it gets developed, we will not be.
And it could potentially be pedestrian and not car access, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and again, that gets a little tricky to determine right now without having a development program. And loading and, parcelization plan and that sort of thing. I think there's general guidance that we can provide, but it won't be super specific.
The map sort of shows that D Street access coming pretty much right there at the corner of the next building on the avenue. Does that change your massing projections at all?
No.
It looks intrusive, I think, on some of the height things that you showed, where it starts to stick out and be really high.
So that wouldn't, but it does change like the size of the development parcel that would then be created. So you either have a big triangle if you have, only the 30-foot build to line, and then you have a very small triangle if you maintain small triangle parcel if you put in D Street and maintain the 75-foot build to line, and that's definitely something we're looking at too.
Would an arcade be kind of entertained as
It could be. It certainly could be. I think, again, it sort of gets difficult to, I don't know that we would offer guidelines with regard to that. I think we would probably leave that specific design up to the developer.
Are you asking about that arcade over D Street?
Yeah.
I was imagining through the triangle site.
Oh, no, I was thinking that D Street would be
a connection
maybe
over D Street,
right.
Like a meaningful like city center type thing. I think that is possible. I mean, that could be, that could be envisioned. That actually is one of the ways in which you can get height across that area. Transfer the 160-foot height. Anything else? So we're going to take public comments on this presentation through Friday, May 13th, and then we'll be back this summer with another public meeting, but also feel free to attend our June commission meeting as well. Thank you so much for coming today, and I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards as well.